He never learned my name. Not really. 11 years, and I was always the mechanic, the woman with the careful hands who kept his kingdom breathing while he looked past me like I was part of the wall. I told myself that was fine. I told myself that so many times it stopped feeling like a lie. The morning he said I was replaceable, I didn't argue. I picked up my coat. I walked out into a November Tuesday in Topeka and stood on Kansas Avenue while the city moved around me. And the terrible thing, the thing I am still sitting with, is that some part of me had been waiting for him to say it for years. Like I needed him to confirm what I'd already decided about myself. I was very good at leaving quietly. I had practice. If you've ever made yourself smaller to keep something whole, and then been told it was nothing, stay with me. This story is for you. And if you want to find your way back here after tonight, the subscribe button is right below. This is where women who understand that kind of quiet come to feel less alone. The heart clock was bigger than the job description had suggested. That's the most honest thing I can say about my first week in the observatory, that nothing matched what I'd been told to expect, and I was too proud to admit it. The posting had said maintenance of a large horological mechanism for a private estate. What I walked into was a cathedral of gold gears running floor to ceiling in a circular chamber, the air thick with a smell of warm metal and something underneath it I couldn't name then. Something like bread left too long in the oven. Something organic. Wrong in a way I filed and didn't examine. I was 43 years old. I had spent 20 years repairing clocks in a shop on a street in a city where no one cared how precise I was, only that I was cheap. I was not naive. I was not inexperienced. I walked into that gear room and told myself I had seen everything. I had not seen anything. The face marked with his name was on the far wall, framed in darker gold than the rest, the letters Maxwell Lance pressed into the metal in a script that was old enough to have its own gravity. I stood in front of it for longer than was professional. The face was stopped. Not broken, stopped. The way a clock stops when something at its center has ceased to move. I didn't touch it that first day. I circled the room instead, logging what I could see: pivot points, gear ratios, the state of the secondary faces along the perimeter walls, each one ticking steadily with names I didn't recognize pressed into their rims. Everything on the perimeter ran. Only his face was still. My log entry for that first day was 3 pages. My entry for the mainspring housing was 2 words: requires attention. It required more than attention. I understood this the moment I pressed my palms to the housing to take a temperature reading, a standard diagnostic, nothing more, and felt the mechanism do something I have never been able to describe in technical terms. It recognized something. Not me, exactly. Something in the warmth of my hands against the cold gold. The gears closest to the housing gave a single, low rotation, as if waking from a long dream. The clock face on the far wall, his face ticked. Once. Then stopped again. I pulled my hands back. Checked them. They looked the same. My palms ached the way they ache in cold weather, that deep joint ache that lives below the skin. I wrote nothing in my log about this. He came to the gear room once a week. Thursdays. Always at the same hour, late enough in the afternoon that the light through the high windows had gone flat and directionless. He didn't speak to me. He would stand in the doorway, survey the room with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent centuries deciding what matters, and then he would leave. I learned his rhythm the way you learn the rhythm of a room, not by studying it, but by being inside it long enough that the pattern becomes part of your body. I told myself I wasn't paying attention to him. 3 weeks in, I overheard him in the corridor outside the gear room, speaking to his chamberlain, a thin, careful man named Corvin who moved through the observatory like a draft. I caught only the end of it. The mechanics settling in, I take it. Not a question. Not curiosity. The tone of a man confirming that a piece of furniture had been properly arranged. The mechanic. I went back to my work. I recalibrated a secondary pivot arm that didn't need recalibrating. I was very thorough about it. The first time I wound the mainspring with my hands, deliberately knowing what I was doing, was a Wednesday in my 3rd week just past midnight. I had been working late, logging the secondary phases when I heard it, a sound from the main housing like a held breath about to give. The mechanism wasn't failing. It was simply waiting. I stood in front of the housing for a full minute before I pressed my palms flat against the gold. The click came from somewhere I couldn't locate on a schematic. The clock breathed. His face, across the room, resumed its tick, steady and low, like a heart remembering it has a job to do. My palms ached for 3 days afterward. A warmth that left slowly, the way heat leaves a stone after the sun goes down. I catalogued the sensation with the same precision I applied to everything: the depth of the ache, the duration, the pattern of recovery. I told myself it was a transferable energy, some ambient warmth from my body absorbed by the cold mechanism. I did not let myself think about what it meant that the warmth was mine. Midnight after midnight, I came back. I wound what couldn't be wound by any key I'd ever held. The clock kept breathing. The kingdom kept its rhythm. And the silver-haired king, who had named me the mechanic, walked past my door every Thursday without once looking in. I told myself I didn't need him to look. The last thing I remember from that third week, the detail that stayed with me long after everything else, is standing at the mainspring housing at midnight with my palms still warm against the gold, the observatory completely silent except for the tick, and understanding, very quietly, that this was the closest I had come to feeling known in years. Not by him, by the clock. That should have told me something. 11 years teaches you a particular kind of patience. Not the patience of waiting for something good, the other kind. The patience of a woman who has learned to hold a concern in her hands for so long that it stops feeling urgent, even when it is. I noticed the hesitation in Maxwell's tick on a Tuesday morning in early October, the way you notice a change in someone's breathing when you have been in the same room with them long enough. Not a sound exactly. A gap. A fraction of a second disappearing into the space between beats, quiet as a word swallowed before it reaches the mouth. I logged it. I did not go to him immediately. I told myself this was professionalism, that I needed more data before making a claim. 3 weeks of logs. 72 entries. The gap widening by increments too small for anyone else to measure, but I was not anyone else. I had been listening to that clock since before I understood what I was listening to. The truth is, I knew by the end of the first week. I waited 3 more because I did not want to stand in front of him. His receiving chamber was on the lower floor of the observatory, past the corridor where the narrow Gothic windows let in the kind of light that belongs to a Kansas November, flat, gray, with no warmth left in it even at midday. October had no business producing that light, but it was doing it anyway. The whole morning felt a season ahead of itself. I knocked. Corvin let me in. Maxwell was at his desk. Dark wood, wide as a door. He did not look up when I entered, which was not new. He had a habit of finishing his thought before acknowledging a room had changed around him. I stood and waited, and kept my hands at my sides. The chamber smelled of old paper, and something metallic underneath it, faint as a memory. Cold air came from somewhere I couldn't locate. When he finally looked up, his attention settled on me the way a survey settles on terrain, assessing function, not character. He said nothing. The silence was an instruction. Be concise. I was concise. I told him his clock face was losing time. A fraction of a second per hour, consistent across 3 weeks of observation, widening in a pattern that suggested interference at the source rather than the surface mechanism. I told him I could not diagnose the cause without access to the archive records of the clock's original calibration, what it had been set to before I arrived, who had set it, and under what conditions. I told him this calmly, the way I would describe a gear that needed replacing. He listened. His face gave nothing. Then he looked at me, directly, the way he had never quite managed in 11 years, and held that look for a moment that had weight to it. Any court engineer can read a clock, Miss Bond. His voice was even. Not cruel. That was the thing about it. Cruelty would have been easier to carry. If you've reached the limits of what you understand, I can easily find someone who hasn't. I thanked him for his time. I heard myself say the words. I noted that my voice was steady. I turned and walked out of the chamber, and down the corridor and up the stairs to the gear room, and I did not stop moving until I had closed the gear room door behind me. Then I stood very still. The clock ticked around me, all the secondary faces in their steady rhythm, the warm metal smell of the room settling over me the way it always did, like a temperature I'd calibrated to without noticing. My log was open on the work table. 72 entries. 3 weeks of evidence I had gathered with more care than I had given most things in my life. I looked at it for a long time without touching it. The room did not offer an opinion. The clock simply ticked. I pressed my palms to the mainspring housing at 2 in the afternoon. Not because it was midnight. Not because the mechanism needed it. My hands had been moving without purpose since I left his chamber, straightening tools, picking up components and setting them down in the same position, occupying themselves with the shape of work without the substance of it. Pressing my palms to the housing was the only way I knew to make them stop. The click came. The gears closest to the housing gave their low rotation. The warmth left my hands and went somewhere I couldn't follow. I stood there with my palms against the cold gold and told myself, with great precision, that I was not doing this because I needed something to receive what I was giving. I told myself the timing was coincidental. I was a professional making a standard diagnostic contact. The ache in my palms by evening told me what I already knew about the things I told myself. Walking back up to the gear room, I had rehearsed a different version of the conversation. The one where I laid the logs on his desk, where I said, "This is not a reading problem, this is a source problem, and you do not have anyone else who understands what the source is." The version where he looked at the evidence and revised his opinion of me in the space of a sentence. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, I had run through 6 variations of this conversation. In none of them did he say what he actually said. That was the part one kept returning to, standing at the housing with my palms going warm and then warmer and then beginning to ache. Not that he'd dismissed me, but that I had walked in there with 11 years of evidence and he had looked through it like it was weather. Like I was something happening outside a window he'd already decided not to open. The decision I'd been circling for 3 weeks arrived without announcement. Not a dramatic turn. Not a moment I could point to afterward and say, "There, that was it." More like the way a room goes quiet after a sound stops. You realize the sound is gone only because the absence of it has changed the air. I would go back downstairs in the morning. I would log the day's readings. I would do my work, but I would do it knowing something I had spent 11 years trying not to know. He would never look at what I was actually doing, and I had been giving him everything anyway. The decision, once made, had a quality of stillness to it. That surprised me. I had expected something louder, some internal argument that needed winning, some version of myself that needed convincing. What I got instead was quiet. The particular quiet of a thing that has already been true for some time, finally permitted to be said out loud. I had known I was leaving since 2 in the afternoon. By the time the observatory clock marked 10 at night, I had simply caught up to what my hands already understood. I did not pack. There was nothing here that was mine in a way that required carrying. I completed the evening rounds the same way I had completed every evening round for 11 years. Secondary clock faces first, working clockwise from the north wall, checking the faces of the kingdom's souls the way a night nurse checks her patients, not because any of them were failing, but because the check itself was the care. I noted two that had dimmed slightly at the edges, logged them, scheduled a calibration I would not be there to perform. I wrote the calibration note anyway, left it dated and specific, the way you leave instructions for someone you trust to follow them, even knowing no one like that exists yet. The oil can was almost empty. I used what remained on the pivot arms that genuinely needed it and set the can down on the work table without replacing it. My log for the evening took 11 minutes to complete. Same handwriting I had used since my first week, small, level, unornamented. A reader encountering it for the first time would not be able to tell tonight's entry from one written 6 years ago. I had been consistent. That had always seemed like a virtue. Looking at the log now, I was less certain. The note took longer. I sat at the work table with a blank page for a while before I began. Not because I didn't know what to say. I knew exactly what to say. I had known it for years, in the way you know a thing you have decided not to need. The problem was finding the shape of it. How do you describe, in technical terms, something that has no technical explanation? I tried several times, crossed out more than I kept. What I finally wrote was this: the mainspring housing does not respond to mechanical force. It responds to living warmth, applied with open palms, at consistent pressure, for no less than 4 minutes. The coil requires this contact at midnight, within a margin of 30 minutes either side. If contact is not maintained, the primary mechanism will slow and eventually cease. The secondary phases will follow. I cannot tell you why this is true. I can only tell you that it is, and that I have done it every night for 11 years, and that it will need someone to do it now. I folded the note 3 times. Precise folds, each crease pressed flat with my thumbnail. The fold that would hold it upright behind the housing plate. I had measured this once, years ago, when I first understood that the note might need to exist. The paper fit the gap exactly. I did not let myself think about what it meant that I had known this moment was coming long enough to measure for it. The strand of hair I took from the back of my head, where it would not be missed in my reflection. The knot I had discovered in my 3rd year, working late with the housing open, when the coil had slipped its tension and I had nothing on hand to hold it. My fingers had done something instinctive, a knot my grandmother had used on her garden twine, tight without cutting, yielding without loosening, and the coil had held. I had tested it every configuration I could devise afterward. Nothing held the tension constant the way that knot did. I had never been able to replicate its effect mechanically. I had stopped trying. I tied the knot around the coil by feel. My hands knew it the way hands know things learned before the mind gets involved. The hair was fine enough that it disappeared into the mechanism once the housing was closed. No engineer opening that plate would see it as anything but a stray thread, unless they looked for it. I closed the housing. My palms went to the gold without a decision being made. That is the most accurate way I can describe it. My body moved, and my mind followed, and my hands were already flat against the housing before I had finished whatever thought I'd been attempting. The metal was cold in the particular way it was always cold, not the cold of an object left in a room, but the cold of something waiting to receive. The click came. The warmth left my hands, moved somewhere I had spent 11 years trying not to name. Wind. The word arrived in me the way words arrive when they have been waiting a long time for the right moment, not as a discovery, but as a recognition. I had been winding, not the clock, myself, taking the tension I had brought into this building at 43 and feeding it out, night after night, thread by thread, into the cold gold of a machine that kept a kingdom breathing while the king, who owned it, looked through me like I was part of the infrastructure. I had wound myself down for him. I stood with my hands against the housing and held that knowledge without trying to do anything with it. The clock ticked around me. The secondary phases kept their rhythm. The air smelled of warm brass and the faint something underneath it, the thing I had never been able to name, that I was now leaving without having named. I was not angry. That was the part one had not expected. I had thought, on the occasions I'd allowed myself to imagine this moment, that anger would be the engine of it. What I had instead was something that felt like the specific tiredness of a woman who has been generous past the point her generosity could sustain, and who has finally, carefully, set the weight down. Not thrown it. Set it. I left at 4 a.m, took my coat, my credential case, the personal log I kept separate from the official one. Everything else belonged to the observatory or to no one. The door closed behind me with the sound of a door that had done this before. The hill down to College Hill was steep in the dark, the grass gone dry and colorless with October, the city grid below laid out in the particular amber of a night that doesn't quite reach dark. Topeka at 4 a.m. has a held quality, not asleep, not awake, simply between, the streets waiting for the day to remember itself. 2 miles east, a freight train moved through the silence. Its horn came low and long, traveling in the way that sound travels in flat country, with room to go, with nothing to stop it, until it was simply gone. I kept walking. 3 days. That is how long it took before Topeka started forgetting things. I had been sleeping in a real bed, mine, the one in the apartment above the dry cleaning shop on Southwest 12th Avenue that smelled permanently of solvent and, underneath that, the particular warmth of steam. I had been waking without an alarm, drinking coffee at the kitchen window while the morning came up over the College Hill rooftops, slow and unhurried, the kind of morning I had not allowed myself to sit inside for a decade. I kept waiting for it to feel like rest. It felt like a held breath. Ruth then knocked on my door on the third morning. She was 71, recently retired from 30 years teaching 6th grade history at a school on SW 29th, and she had the particular self-possession of a woman who has spent her life in rooms where she was the only adult. She knocked twice. Precise. Then waited. I opened the door, and she looked at me with an expression I could not immediately read. "I don't know what I had for breakfast," she said. I waited for the rest of it. I genuinely don't know. She touched the doorframe, lightly, the way you touch something to make sure it's solid. I made it. I ate it. I remember standing at the stove. But the thing I made, the actual thing, I can't locate it. Like it happened on a day I can't get to. I told her it was probably tiredness. I told her to drink some water. I closed the door and stood in my kitchen and did not move for a while. The coffee on the counter went cold while I stood there. By the afternoon, the news was carrying it, in the careful language news uses when it doesn't yet understand what it's describing. A cluster of deaths in the East Side, people whose physicians had documented stable vitals the day before, who had simply stopped, their bodies apparently deciding the count had run out. The anchor used the word unexplained 4 times in 2 minutes. A pharmacy on Wanamaker Road had shut its dispensing system because the dates kept printing a day ahead or a day behind, the pharmacists unable to agree on which. A school in the Potwin neighborhood had sent children home because 3 different clocks in the building showed 3 different times and none of them matched. Topeka had always had things in it that the maps don't mark. The hill the observatory sits on has been on that hill longer than the city around it. And I am not, I learned slowly, the first woman to give something irreplaceable to the power that watches from there. What I had not understood, not fully, not in a way I could hold in my hands, was the size of what the clock was holding together. I had known it intellectually. 11 years of logs. Secondary faces, hundreds of them. Each one a life being kept in its proper rhythm by the mechanism I maintained. I had not known it in my body until now, watching Topeka lose its footing 1 calendar date at a time. I know what this is. I know exactly what this is. I learned about the lights from a delivery man named Wes, who dropped a package at my door on the 4th day and mentioned, in the way people mention things they've already told several other people, that the old tower up on the hill had been lit straight through every night since Tuesday. All night, he said. Every window. Like they're looking for something in there. I thanked him and took the package and set it on the kitchen table without opening it. I stood at the window and looked in the direction of the hill. Though the tower wasn't visible from here, the College Hill trees took care of that, and I thought about the engineers. The court engineers Maxwell had implied he could easily summon to replace my limited understanding. I could picture them with a clarity that surprised me. Careful men with methodical habits, pulling the housing plate open with professional confidence, finding the mechanism in perfect condition because it was in perfect condition. Every gear seated correctly. Every pivot point clean. The mainspring coil holding its tension, held, specifically, by a knot they would not recognize as functional, tied in a material they would not identify as deliberate. They would find nothing wrong. They would be right. Nothing is wrong with the mechanism. The mechanism is not the point. On the 5th day, I made a list. I sat at my kitchen table with a sheet of paper and wrote down, in order, everything I would need to return. The specific tools, the oil formulation I mix myself, the secondary calibration key I kept in my credential case. It was not a long list. I had always worked with very little. The items fit in 8 lines, with room to spare. I read it once. I folded it in thirds, not the precise folds of the note I had left in the housing, nothing so deliberate as that, just the fold of something you want to make smaller, and I put it in the kitchen drawer under a takeout menu from a Thai place on SW6 that had closed 2 years ago. I told myself I was filing it, that it was practical to have it written down, that having it written down was not the same as having decided anything. I did not look at the drawer again for the rest of the day. That night, I lay in my real bed and listened to the apartment settle around me, the dry cleaning machinery 2 floors below going quiet, the street outside marking out its ordinary hours, and I thought about his face in the receiving chamber. The quality of his attention when he finally looked at me. The way dismissal, when it comes from someone who has never quite looked at you, lands differently than you expect. Not like a blow, like a door, closing on a room you were not aware you had been standing outside of. The ache in my palms was still there. Duller now. Deeper. The kind of ache that stops announcing itself and simply becomes part of the body's background. I had not pressed my hands to anything warm in 5 days. I was not going to think about what that meant. Outside, 2 miles east, there was no freight train. The night was simply quiet, the kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like the city holding itself carefully, the way you hold something you're not sure you trust yourself to carry. The drawer was 8 feet from where I lay. I did not open it. The knock came on a Saturday. 2 clean strikes. Measured. The knock of a man who does not expect to be ignored, but is prepared to wait. I was at the kitchen window with my second coffee, watching the dry cleaning shop's awning below hold itself against a thin November wind, and the sound went through me the way a tuning fork goes through a room. Not loud, just precise. Precise in a way that had nothing to do with volume. I set the mug down. I did not move toward the door immediately. I stood at the window for another moment, looking at nothing, while my body made several small preparations my mind had not authorized. My shoulders dropped. My hands, which had not been fully still in 8 days, went quiet at my sides. I knew. He was in white. Of course he was. A suit that belonged to no decade I could name with confidence, worn on a street where the neighbors drove pickup trucks and left their recycling bins out a day early. He stood in my doorway on Southwest 12th Avenue with the particular stillness of a man who has stopped pretending the trip here cost him nothing, and everything about the way he held himself told me the pretense had been expensive to maintain even this long. He had her note in his left hand. My note. Folded along creases that were not mine, he had opened it, read it, folded it differently, as if he'd needed to put it away, and found he couldn't leave it behind. The cold came off him the way cold comes off stone in a closed room. Underneath it, underneath the cold, underneath the white wool and the 400 years of untouchable composure, was the smell I had only ever caught in traces in the gear room. Not brass. Not any metal I had a name for. Something older than the building. Something that had been present in the observatory all along and that I had attributed, each time, to the mechanism. It was not the mechanism. He looked at me with the same directness he had used in the receiving chamber. The same quality of attention, complete, measuring, without social softening. What was different was what lived behind it. In the chamber, looking at me had been a function, the way checking a gauge is a function. This was not that. This was the face of a man who has read something he cannot unread and has been standing inside that reading for 8 days. He did not speak immediately. I did not fill the silence. I had spent too many years filling silences for people who didn't notice. I brought 3 engineers, he said. They couldn't find the mechanism you were using. I know. A beat. Because it wasn't a mechanism. He looked at the note in his hand, then at me. Then he said, with a precision that told me he had chosen the word carefully, "What was it?" Not a question. A man who has decided he will accept the answer, whatever shape it takes. I stepped back from the door. He came in because I had stepped back, not because I had said anything. He stood in my small kitchen in his white suit and looked at the space with the same survey he used in the observatory, taking inventory, assessing function. except that here there was nothing to assess. A work table, 2 chairs, a drawer he had no way of knowing held a folded list of everything I would have needed to return. I sat at the table. He remained standing, which I expected. I told him what the mainspring was. I told him in the same plain language I had used in the note, because I was too tired, as I had known I would be, to construct a version of this that protected either of us from the full weight of it.
What the housing responded to.
What my hands had been doing at midnight. What it cost, measured in the ache I woke with every morning for 11 years and had catalogued so consistently I had stopped registering it as a cost. I watched his face. It was the first time I had watched his face with full attention. In the gear room, I had always been watching the clock. In the corridor, the back of his head as he left. In the chamber, I had been managing my own expression too carefully to study his. His face, receiving what I was telling him, did something I had no prior data for. The composure stayed. It was structural. In him, not performed, but inside it, something was being rearranged. The shape of what I had been to him, what he had allowed me to be, the category he had placed me in, the mechanic, the useful and replaceable function. I watched him encounter the actual dimensions of that category and find them entirely wrong. He did not look away.
My hands were still in my lap.
I noticed this only when he asked his third question. Careful, specific, the kind of question an engineer asks when he is determined to understand a system he cannot dismantle. And I reached for a word, and my hands did not move to illustrate it the way they had been doing, restlessly and without permission, for 8 days straight. They were simply still, resting against my own legs. Quiet. I could not remember the last time they had felt like mine. He asked me how long I had known the mechanism required this. The living warmth, the open palms, the midnight timing. How long I had known, and not told him. I said, since the 3rd week. He was quiet for long enough that the dry-cleaning machinery below us cycled through a full press. Then, 11 years. Not an accusation. Something more uncomfortable than an accusation. A man doing arithmetic on himself. On what he had failed to notice for 11 years because he had decided, at the beginning, what I was, and had never revisited the decision. Yes, I said. The words sat between us. Small.
Exact.
He looked at the note again. At the fold lines that were his, not mine. His jaw held a tension I recognized, the tension of a man who has an instinct toward authority and is actively refusing to deploy it because he understands, perhaps for the first time, that deploying it here would be obscene. I didn't know, he said. Not an excuse. A statement of fact from a man taking inventory of his own blindness. I know you didn't. The cold air from the open window moved between us. Outside on SW12th, a car passed slowly, its radio audible for 3 seconds and then gone. The ordinary Saturday morning of a neighborhood that had nothing to do with either of us, and yet here we were, sitting inside it, with 11 years of midnight between us and no clean way to account for any of it. My hands stayed still. That was the thing I kept returning to afterward.
Not what he said.
Not the note in his hand or the cost written plainly in his face. Just my own hands, resting quietly in my lap, as if they had been waiting for this specific room, this specific accounting, before they could finally stop reaching for something to hold. The silence after I do now had a different quality than the silences before it. I had sat across from this man's absence for 11 years. I knew his silences the way you know the sound of a room you have worked alone in. Every variation, every weight. The silence he used as dismissal. The silence he used as a room's worth of authority, compressed. The silence of a man who has decided the conversation is over without notifying the other person. This was none of those. This was the silence of a man who has said the truest thing he knows how to say and is now waiting, with something that costs him, to learn whether it is enough. I looked at my hands, still in my lap, still quiet. I had spent 8 days watching them move without my permission, picking up objects, setting them down, pressing against surfaces that weren't cold gold, and now they were simply resting. as if the thing they had been searching for had finally walked through my door in a white suit and sat down across my kitchen table, and my hands had recognized it before I did. I did not trust that recognition. I was 54 years old. I had given my best work to a man who had named me the mechanic and meant it as a full accounting. The recognition my hands felt was real. I was not arguing with that, but I had learned in the particular school of my own history that what the body recognizes and what the mind can afford are not always the same thing. He asked me to come back. He did not lead with it. He built toward it the way a man builds toward something he has no clean language for, circling, testing the ground, finding that every direct approach required a word he didn't have. He said the kingdom needed the clock maintained. He said the secondary phases were slowing. He said there were people in Topeka whose remaining time was being miscounted and that the miscounting was accelerating. All of this was true. All of this was also not the thing he was trying to say. I waited. He looked at the note, still in his hand, still refolded along his own creases, and then he said it. Not fluently. Not with the authority he used in every other sentence he had ever spoken in my hearing. The clock is... He stopped. The longest pause I had ever heard from him. Longer than the silence in the receiving chamber. Longer than the survey he used when he entered a room. A pause that had something in it I could not name clinically, only recognize. The pause of a man who has encountered a sentence he cannot finish with certainty, and is deciding to finish it anyway. Asking for you. I did not say yes. I want to be precise about this, because the version of this moment that lives in the body is not the same as the version that lives in the mind, and I am tired of the gap between them. In my body, my hands turned over in my lap, palms up, the way they turn at midnight when I am about to press them to the housing. Involuntary. Immediate. My body had already answered. In my mind, 11 years of log entries. 72 entries recording a warning he had dismissed in a single sentence. A calibration note I had written for a successor who didn't exist yet, dated and specific, left in a gear room I was not supposed to care about anymore. I held both of these things. Then I said, if I come back, I need you to understand what it costs. Every time. Not in the abstract. I need you to know that it is a cost, and that I am the one paying it and that you will not look through me while I do. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the College Hill street held its Saturday stillness. A dog somewhere, a screen door 2 houses over, the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood with no idea what was sitting at my table. He said, I do now. 3 words. No elaboration. The voice of a man who has understood that elaboration here would be a way of making this about himself. I looked at him for a long time. Not to make him wait. I was past performing distance, had left it somewhere on the observatory stairs 8 days ago. I looked at him because I was deciding, genuinely deciding. The woman who had pressed her palms to cold gold for 11 years because she needed something to receive her warmth was not the woman making this decision. That woman had already left. The one sitting here had walked down the hill in the dark and slept in her own bed and watched Topeka lose its footing and had not gone back. This woman was choosing. 2 miles east, a freight train moved through the dark. Its horn came the same way it always came, low, long, traveling across flat country with room to go and nothing to stop it. The same horn I had heard the morning I left, standing on the hill with my coat and my credential case, and the particular tiredness of a woman who has finally set something down. The city had been holding that sound in the same breath this whole time. Wind. The word arrived the way it had arrived in the gear room on my last midnight, not as discovery, but as recognition. Only this time the meaning had turned. Not the image of a woman feeding herself out thread by thread into a machine that didn't know her name. Something else. The thing a watchmaker does when she picks up a mechanism she has chosen to care for, deliberately, with full knowledge of its cost, because she has decided it is worth her hands. The difference between giving because the alternative is emptiness, and giving because you know precisely what you have and you are choosing, with both eyes open, to offer it. That difference is everything. That difference is the whole of it. I stood up. Crossed to the hook by the door where my coat had hung for 8 days without being touched. Took it down. My hands were warm. I did not tell him I forgave him. I did not know yet if I did, and I was too old to say things I hadn't finished deciding. Forgiveness is not a door you walk through once. It is a thing you build, slowly, with materials that take time to arrive. I had the foundation. The rest would require more mornings than this one. He rose when I rose. Waited while I buttoned the coat. Did not offer to help, which was correct. He was learning, in real time, the difference between being useful and being present, and he was paying attention. We walked out the door, together into the November night. The air smelled of brass. Cold pavement. Something underneath both of those. The particular smell of a city that has been holding its breath for 8 days and is only now beginning to remember how to exhale. The heart clock on the hill above Topeka waited. I had wound myself down for 11 years without knowing I was doing it. This time, I was going back knowing exactly what I carried and choosing for the first time to decide what it was worth. If something in this story reached you, if you recognize that woman who wound herself down for someone who never looked, you're not alone in it. There are others here. Women who've sat with that particular silence. Stories like this one, waiting. Subscribe if you want to find your way back. This is where we gather.